I had no expectations when I started playing Kena: Bridge of Spirits, a PS5 title I acquired to fill the gap between mid-November and December. This is the debut game from Ember Lab, and judging solely on the product they've released here, it almost certainly won't be their last. It feels weird to say that this is a debut game for a studio, when perhaps the best word to describe Kena is familiar. Each and every facet feels like it's warm and safe blanket, or a stuffed animal you've had since you were a child. The game sets out to invoke a feeling of wonderment and exploration, and does so successfully most of the time. The titular protagonist is on a quest that sees her follow in her father's footsteps to release the trapped spirits of the departed from whatever unfinished business is tying them to the land. In the process, she comes across cute little creatures called Rot, which I'm going to refer to as Rotlings because that is what they look like to me. And they provide a mean to progress while also just being charming and oh my god level adorable. The bulk of the story centers around a fallen village, as Kena helps the spirits of those who live there move on. This village acts as the center point of the map, and the story Kena embarks upon is well paced, and new platforming abilities like the grapple, bombs, and Rotling commands are handed out quite early on. The game also gives you double jump and a melee attack combo from the start, rather than gating those off to provide token unlocks. In this regard, Kena caters to players familiar with other RPGs, and the same holds true within combat. Both fighting and the traversal here reminded me heavily of Horizon Zero Dawn. The way Kena swings her staff, draws her bow, dodges attacks, and climbs rocks are very Aloy-esque. Aloy's own version of this was based on a heavy dose of the Uncharted and Tomb Raider games before it. These mechanics certainly work here. They don't feel out of place or badly done. However, the reactiveness of the controls and the general feel of the animation here doesn't quite reach the same level as Horizon, for obvious reasons. Light and heavy attacks can be chained together, and her abilities mixed in, and I was very thankful that Kena's arrows do recharge over time, because this never felt restrictive in a bad way. The Rotlings themselves are quite useful in combat, as they can distract larger enemies while you clean up the adds, or pin down a bigger target for you to focus your attacks on. These commands come at the cost of a courage gauge, and these can be earned by beating more enemies. In general, combat feels good, and while it's not the main selling point of the game, it's certainly been tuned to a very high standard. It's not a joke in terms of difficulty either. Playing on the game's Spirit Guide, I did have a few early deaths while I was learning the controls and how reactive the dodge button was. The window for parrying here is a little harsher than you'd expect. It's not quite as tight as something like Sekiro's, but you do have to raise Kena's shield a fraction of a second later than you might want to do on instinct. Although the combat is good, it's not what I view as the game's primary draw. That award goes to its world, puzzle solving, and exploration elements. And that starts with the art style. Kena: Bridge of Spirits looks like a DreamWorks movie, and during a lot of the cutscenes, it feels like one too. I played this on the PS5, and while the visual fidelity wasn't as perfect as it might have been on PC, this is still a very, very pretty game. Compounding the DreamWorks feel is the Rotlings themselves. These are just beyond adorable companions who follow Kena around and provide a portion of her platforming and traversal powers. You collect these by exploring the world, searching under rocks, in pots and chests after clearing bosses. These little guys can be adorned with cute hats that can be purchased from the game's hat stand or looted in the world. These characters don't speak, but are somehow just so full of charm. Even just letting the camera idle for a bit shows off the work put into them, and they're always popping up in the areas you visit, hiding on shelves or behind rocks when they're scared, or grouping up to perform this demon-looking thing when you need to clear corruption. Kena might be the protagonist on the box, but the Rotlings steal the show time and time again. While the Rot might be full of character, the enemies here are sadly not. The design feels quite cliché, with the usual ground enemies with shield, flying enemies, larger powerful enemies with weak spots, and spellcasters being present. In truth, there are not many ways to escape these tropes in this type of game, and we're all visually unique, just not visually spectacular. I feel a bit more colour on these enemies would go a long way, and aside from the name bosses, they're all quite forgettable. The other characters Kena meets fall into two categories, those who feel transactional, like the enemies. These include Zaju, Hana, and Drusu. They're in the game to provide traversal powers or to contextualize the next spirit you need to save. The others are the spirits themselves. These are unique, well-designed and memorable, like Taro and his brothers, or Adria and Toshi. Your time with each of these characters is short and mostly told through flashbacks, and I feel fleshing out these a bit more would go a long way to helping anchor the emotional punches the game is trying to land. Outside of that, my only major nitpick is that the lip syncing is way off in some instances, and can be a really jarring observation when you're invested in the story. And you will get emotionally invested in the story. The art style, crescendoing music, and the overall inevitability of Kena's role all play a part in drawing you into the game world. At certain points, I even paused the TV show I was watching on my other screen because I wanted to give my undivided attention to this game. These heavily curated parts of the story are where the game shines. because outside of it, there are some irregularities. Sometimes the music will just start to build up for no apparent reason. I just start looking around for the epic moment that I thought was coming my way, only to realise I was just solving a puzzle and had taken too long. Other times you'll be running through the village and a random frame drop would occur. These were few and far between, but I was playing on the PS5's performance mode and I did expect this to run pretty flawlessly at 60 FPS. During one particular boss fight, I managed to trap myself in a slow motion mode. This forced me to reload a save, but it did show off some of the game's constraints, particularly when it comes to combat animations. Kena: A Bridge of Spirits handles progression using the tried and true formula of skill unlocks. These are purchased using a currency gained by defeating enemies or for overcoming challenges, and are gated by rot level. There are 4 avenues for progression, each with a few abilities to unlock, and then rot abilities on top, which add new tools to your arsenal, like a power slam or a piercing arrow. Progression in terms of Kena's abilities is minimal at best, and I was never asked to make meaningful decisions about how I wanted to improve my combat arsenal. You can improve Kena's health by finding meditation spots in the world, and the rest of the game's progression feels quite similar. You tend to get a lot of the better powers quite early on, and then spend the rest of the game slowly improving them in minor ways, rather than being 6 or 8 hours in and being able to use your points to give yourself a new toy to play with. Other forms of progression exist by giving Kena certain traversal powers, like unlocking the bow or the dash. These are usually gated by the story and aren't missable. Collecting hats and all the rotlings are side activities for the most part that don't truly affect or improve your character in any way. The hats are cosmetic only, and you do stumble across enough rotlings down the main path that you won't ever be gated from unlocking skills, unless you deliberately ignore the ones you do encounter. It's very clear to me that Kena took inspiration from many other games. The rotlings feel like Breath of the Wild's Koroks, and I've already mentioned how combat and gameplay feels like Horizon Zero Dawn. The setting and the art style again take a lot of inspiration from the DreamWorks movies, but none of it feels bad. Plenty of games take inspiration from those that have come before, and thanks to the careful study of their contemporaries, this doesn't feel like a debut game from Ember Lab. This feels polished and refined. And aside from the length, there are no obvious indications that this wasn't done by a larger and more historically successful studio. As I bring this to a close, I think it's important to look at what the game achieves without spoiling too much of the story. It provides quiet moments of reflection and deep yet child-friendly conversations about the inevitability of death. Kena reaches for a lofty goal and reaches it, even if some of the characters could certainly do with more screen time. Alternatively, you can look at this game as a 15-hour distraction from the aforementioned inevitability of death, by a game focused on exploration with a stunning art style underpinning every aspect of it. Sure, not every tree or rock is perfect, and some of Kena's animations could be improved, like how her left arm behaves when sprinting. These are well within what I'm willing to tolerate based on everything else here. If you go trophy hunting, you're likely to squeeze out another 5 hours of the game, and perhaps another 10 if you decide to try the game on its hardest difficulty, which unlocks after your first clear. Despite its short length, Kena: Bridge of Spirits is an easy recommendation for gamers of all ages, and has all but guaranteed that I'll buy the next title Ember Lab produces. This feels like the start of something special, and I cannot wait to see what this studio does next.